The children mocked their mother for being old and deaf, but when they read her will, they discovered a truth that destroyed them. The mansion where Gordana Petrović lived seemed a silent reflection of her soul, vast, imposing, but terribly empty. At 79 years old, Gordana was used to the echo of her solitary footsteps along the corridors that were once filled with laughter, conversations, and the vibrant energy of a united family. Now every corner of the house told a story of bygone days, of happier times that disappeared along with Dragan, her beloved husband. Losing him was not just the absence of a partner, but the end of a shared dream they had built together, brick by brick, both in life and in business. Gordana and Dragan had founded an export company that thrived for decades. They were the perfect couple. He was a visionary who always saw opportunities where others saw only risks, and she was a natural strategist whose prudence and skill with numbers kept the business on track. When Dragan suddenly passed away, Gordana not only lost her husband, but also the anchor that kept her life stable. The company began to decline without Dragan's charismatic leadership, and despite Gordana's best efforts, the business was no longer the same. The decisions she had confidently made alongside Dragan now turned into lonely and doubtful nightmares. Visits from her children, Milan and Jelena, were increasingly rare and brief. On the few occasions they came, they always seemed in a hurry, as if the time spent with their mother was an inconvenience in their already full schedules. They exchanged empty words and distracted looks, leaving Gordana with the feeling that she was being left behind by those she loved most. She tried to keep a conversation going, to find some spark of connection, but received only monosyllabic responses and mechanical smiles, as if they were fulfilling an obligation. Gordana often found herself rereading old letters from Dragan, memories of a time when everything seemed possible. His words of love and encouragement, even written decades before, were a comfort amid her loneliness, but nothing could fill the void she felt. She looked at the family photos scattered around the house, each one a reminder of how things used to be: family Christmas parties, summer vacations, and her children's birthdays. Now these moments seemed to belong to another life, to another person. The desire to reconnect with her children became an obsession for Gordana. She bought gifts, made phone calls, and tried to arrange family lunches, but all her attempts were in vain. Jelena always had an excuse: the job, her daughter, unavoidable commitments. Milan was more direct, often simply ignoring his mother's attempts to reconnect. The frustration and pain of being constantly rejected began to weigh on Gordana, affecting not only her emotions, but also her physical health. The days dragged on, and Gordana began to notice something was wrong. Sometimes she couldn't hear the phone ring or notice the sound of footsteps in the garden. Her children's words, when they rarely came, sounded muffled, distant, as if they were in a dream. A medical consultation provided a relentless diagnosis: severe hearing loss. The news devastated her, not so much because of the deafness itself, but because of the realization that her world was closing in even more. Gordana returned to the mansion with a sense of defeat. The walls now seemed taller, colder, and the silence became deafening. Sitting in Dragan's favorite armchair, Gordana watched the garden through the window, where the flowers she and Dragan had planted together still bloomed, indifferent to the chaos around her. She felt like a stranger in her own home, a prisoner of her memories and the silence that now surrounded her. The days became indistinguishable, a routine of loneliness and memories. Gordana began to lose hope that her children would ever see her again as the loving mother she had always been. Her health continued to deteriorate, but the greater pain was in her soul. The mansion, once a symbol of success and love, was now a prison echoing only the sounds of a life that no longer existed. Gordana Petrović, the powerful matriarch and businesswoman, was reduced to a shadow of what she once was, imprisoned in the silence of her own loneliness. Gordana Petrović, once a figure of strength and resilience, now faced the harsh reality of depending on her children to survive. After losing her hearing, Gordana was forced to leave the mansion where she had lived with Dragan and where every corner held precious memories. The transition to life in her children's homes was not easy. It was as if she were invading a space where she was not welcome. Initially, both Milan and Jelena took her in with a sense of obligation, but soon this facade of cordiality began to crumble. In Jelena's house, Gordana settled in a small room at the end of the hallway, far from the hustle and bustle of the house. Jelena, always busy with work and the demands of motherhood, initially did her best to make her mother's stay more comfortable. She prepared Gordana's favorite meals and tried to include her in conversations during dinners. However, as the weeks passed, Jelena began to show signs of weariness. The tasks piled up and her patience dwindled. Gordana, with her hearing impairment, became an increasingly isolated figure, unable to keep up with conversations or participate in family activities. To Jelena, Gordana's needs came to be seen as an additional burden: doctor visits, the need for help with simple tasks like dressing and bathing. Everything seemed to weigh more and more. During dinners, Jelena began making comments about how caring for Gordana was affecting her routine. Even believing that her mother couldn't hear, Jelena spoke in an impatient tone about how much she wished things were different. Meanwhile, Sofija, Jelena's 8-year-old daughter, watched everything with curious and innocent eyes. Sofija was a sensitive child, always attentive to the feelings of others. She perceived her grandmother's silent suffering and, in her childish simplicity, did what she could to bring some comfort. Small gestures, like drawing colorful flowers for Gordana or holding her hand while they walked through the garden, became frequent. Gordana found in Sofija a rare relief for her loneliness. The granddaughter was a sweet and affectionate presence, a thread of joy amid the indifference of her own daughter. After 2 months at Jelena's house, Gordana was taken to Milan's home, where the situation was not much different. Milan, always focused on his career and concerned with maintaining a balance with his wife Verica, seemed reluctant to have his mother in his home. Verica, in turn, made no effort to hide her displeasure with her mother-in-law's presence. Gordana was placed in a tiny room, almost a storage space, where her belongings barely fit. Verica rarely addressed Gordana, and when she did, it was with coldness and impersonality. Gordana began to realize she was ignored at basic moments of the day. Verica often forgot to call her for meals, and Gordana, unable to hear the sounds of the house, relied on instinct and movement around her to know when it was time to eat. On one particularly painful occasion, Gordana sat alone for hours, waiting for a lunch that never came. Hunger, loneliness, and the pain of abandonment were now her constant companions. Milan tried to balance the situation, but his inability to confront Verica made him complicit in the neglect. He began to feel the weight of having Gordana in his home and did not hesitate to comment on this with Jelena when the siblings met. They spoke openly about how their mother was a burden, about the impact it had on their lives. Gordana, sitting nearby, heard fragments of conversations, not through her ears, but through body language, impatient glances, and heavy sighs. They believed she was oblivious to their attitudes. Gordana's mental health continued to deteriorate. The perception of being treated as an unwanted burden by those she once held in her arms and raised with so much love sank her into a pit of sadness. She spent hours in her room, looking at the old photographs she managed to bring with her, photos of Milan and Jelena as children, carefree smiles, warm embraces, moments that now seemed to belong to another life. Each passing day, Gordana felt the weight of isolation and rejection. She was physically present, but emotionally it was as if she had already left. The distance between her and her children was not measured in meters, but in coldness and lack of love. Every indifferent gesture, every word spoken without consideration, were blows that further shattered what remained of her resilient spirit. Sofija, even without fully understanding the complexity of the situation, continued to be the light in Gordana's life. She sensed her grandmother's sadness and in her small gestures tried to alleviate the pain she saw in her eyes. For Gordana, Sofija's innocence was a reminder that genuine love still existed, even if it came in the form of a child's smile or a crayon-drawn picture. As the months passed, Gordana felt more and more like a stranger in her own children's homes. The hope that one day they might treat her with the care and respect she so desired faded day by day. Gordana Petrović, the mother who had once been the pillar of her family, now saw herself as a broken link desperately trying to find a place where she was loved and accepted. But deep down, she knew that place was not in Milan's or Jelena's homes. And, even without being able to hear, Gordana felt the weight of all the unspoken words, of all the gestures that would never happen, and of all the love that was lost along the way. Gordana Petrović had grown accustomed to being ignored, but in Milan's house, neglect took painfully clear proportions. Verica, Milan's wife, did not hide the contempt she felt for her mother-in-law's presence. Gordana's routine was filled with Verica's coldness, who deliberately left the elderly lady on the sidelines of everything. Meals were served carelessly, often cold and rushed, when they weren't simply forgotten. The silence in the house was only interrupted by the sounds of doors slamming, hurried footsteps, and animated conversations that took place at a distance of which Gordana was never a part. Milan, the son she had raised with so much care and dedication, seemed like a stranger. He avoided confrontations with Verica and maintained an air of indifference, pretending not to see the small acts of cruelty committed by his wife. Gordana could sense Milan's discomfort, his effort to balance the desire to keep peace with Verica and the obligation to care for his mother. But each day, Milan seemed more inclined to take the easier path, ignoring Gordana and prioritizing marital harmony. Verica was subtle, but her hostility was always present. When Gordana tried to participate in daily activities, whether it was helping with a simple task in the kitchen or trying to bond with her grandson, Verica found ways to leave her aside. One day, Gordana offered to fold the laundry, a small gesture to feel useful, but Verica, with a cold smile, took the pieces from her hands, saying, "It's not necessary." Gordana smiled, hiding the impact, but inside she felt humiliated, as if she were a worthless burden. In her mind, Gordana often sought refuge in memories of happy times with Dragan. She remembered the sunny mornings on the porch where they had coffee together, planning the future of the business and the family. She remembered the loud laughter of the children running through the garden, the family parties, and the camaraderie she and Dragan shared. Now, these memories were the only solace she had, a reminder that at some point in her life, she had been deeply loved and valued. However, reality imposed itself relentlessly. The contrast between a past full of love and a present filled with coldness made Gordana feel the weight of her situation even more. She knew she was being treated as a burden, and it hurt in a way that words could not express. Gordana might not have been able to hear, but she felt the vibration of every disdainful look, every sigh of impatience. Milan tried to balance the situation, but his inability to confront Verica made him complicit in the neglect. He began to feel the weight of having Gordana in his home, and in phone conversations with Jelena, he vented about the impact of their mother's presence on their lives. Gordana, even without hearing, began to realize that her attempts to connect with her children were nothing but futile efforts. Each day she became more aware of the rejection and emotional distance her children maintained. Gordana began to notice small details that would go unnoticed by many. The way Milan avoided looking her in the eye, the abrupt manner in which Verica closed doors as she passed, every gesture seemed like another step toward complete isolation. Gordana spent most of her days in her room, watching the garden through the window, where the flowers she and Dragan had planted together still bloomed. These flowers were now her only constant companions, living reminders of a past that seemed to drift further and further away. Gordana's mental health continued to deteriorate each day. The perception that she was being treated as an unwanted burden by those she once held in her arms and raised with so much love sank her into a pit of sadness. She spent hours in her room, looking at the old photographs she managed to bring with her, photos of Milan and Jelena as children, carefree smiles, warm embraces, moments that now seemed to belong to another life. Despite not hearing, Gordana was able to capture the tone of conversations through body language and gestures. She sensed something was being plotted, a constant discomfort in her children's attitudes, especially Milan's. Even without hearing the exact words, Gordana could feel the weight of decisions being made at her expense. The expressions of fatigue and frustration on Milan's face when he entered her room were more revealing than any sound. Gordana returned to her room, her heart heavy and her mind filled with memories that now only brought pain. She sat on the bed and looked at a family photo on her nightstand. The same people who smiled at her in that old image were now the ones wishing to see her out of their lives. Gordana hugged the photograph to her chest, feeling the warm tears streaming down her face. Even in her silence, she understood everything, and it devastated her. The afternoon was hot and stuffy when Milan and Jelena decided to meet at Milan's house to discuss Gordana's future. It was rare for them to meet without their families, but this time the conversation required a certain degree of privacy. Milan made strong coffee, as he did on intense work days, and Jelena settled into the armchair in the living room with a tired and worried look. The weight of responsibilities and the stress of dealing with their mother's constant presence in their homes had taken its toll. "This can't go on like this," Jelena began, stirring her coffee without much interest. "It's not a life for any of us. I know she's our mother, but it's too much." Milan nodded, looking at the floor. "I feel the same way. Verica is at her limit, and, honestly, so am I. Every day there's a new problem, another burden. We can't continue like this." The two fell silent for a few moments, the sound of coffee being stirred the only noise in the room. They both knew that the solution they were looking for would not be easy or morally right, but the growing discomfort they felt around Gordana pushed them toward a definitive decision. They began exploring possibilities, each suggestion seeming more distant and unfeasible than the previous one, until, in a moment of frustration and despair, Jelena raised the idea that would change everything. What if we put her in a nursing home? A good one, of course. They say she would be well taken care of, would have other people her age to talk to, Jelena suggested hesitantly, as if testing the idea in her own mind before fully voicing it. Milan considered his sister's words. The idea seemed the perfect solution to a problem neither of them wanted to face anymore. "Yeah, maybe that could work," Milan replied slowly. "But how are we going to convince Mom? She would never accept something like that." Jelena smiled slightly, somewhat bitterly. "She thinks we don't hear or notice, but Mom is more vulnerable than ever. And if we convince her it's a resort, a place where she could relax, have fun, make new friends." Milan nodded, beginning to see the plan's feasibility. Gordana, with her deafness and trust in her children, wouldn't suspect. She always talked about wanting a break, something to get away from the routine. If we sell the idea as something temporary, she'll believe it. The two began to elaborate the plan in detail, discussing how they would present the proposal to Gordana and how they would handle the practical issues. They chose a nursing home in another city, far enough that frequent visits wouldn't be expected and, most importantly, away from the critical eyes of neighbors and acquaintances who might judge their decision. It was a discreet place, with a somewhat pleasant appearance, but Milan and Jelena knew that deep down, the nursing home was just a way to get rid of a problem they were unwilling to face. The following week, Jelena took on the task of speaking with Gordana. She approached the subject with forced kindness, smiling convincingly as she showed pictures of the resort on her phone. Gordana, surprised and touched by her children's apparent concern for her well-being, began to get excited about the idea. She read on the phone screen that it was a resort, and for a moment her eyes sparkled with the possibility of change. It seemed like a chance to free herself from the burden of being a nuisance to her children, a time for herself. "It's just for a while, Mom," Jelena said, putting her arm around Gordana in a caring gesture. "It will be good for you. You'll meet new people, relax a bit." Gordana smiled, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in months. Maybe this resort was what she needed to renew her strength and perhaps even reconnect with her children in a lighter and more carefree way. Gordana began packing her things enthusiastically, carefully choosing the clothes she would take and the books she would like to read during the trip. She made sure to bring some family photos as a reminder that, no matter where she was, her children would always be with her in spirit. On the day of departure, Milan and Jelena drove her, keeping the atmosphere light and relaxed. Gordana watched the landscape change through the window, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. Deep down, she felt a slight unease, but decided to ignore it, focusing on the new experience to come. Upon arriving at the nursing home, a discreet building without much decoration, Gordana hesitated for a brief moment. The facade didn't exactly look like a resort, but Milan and Jelena's encouraging smiles made her move forward. Gordana entered the building with slow steps, looking around. The walls were an impersonal white with few decorations. The smell of disinfectant in the air was strong. A staff member with a forced smile greeted them, while Jelena showed Gordana on her phone that this was the correct location of the resort. Gordana felt a tightness in her chest, but still held her smile, trying to believe in the narrative presented by her children. When the admission procedures were completed and Milan and Jelena said their goodbyes, Gordana was finally alone in her new room. She sat on the bed and looked around, noticing the marks of other occupants on the walls and worn-out furniture. The simple and impersonal room was nothing like what Gordana had imagined. The silence was almost absolute, and reality began to settle in relentlessly. Gordana took one of the family photos she had brought and held it tightly. The longing for Dragan was overwhelming, and for the first time, she realized she had been deceived. She wasn't in a resort, and whatever this place was, it was not somewhere she would have chosen for herself. The sadness and sense of abandonment overwhelmed her, but Gordana, determined to face this new trial, raised her head and took a deep breath. Life had taught her to be strong, and even in the face of her children's betrayal, she promised herself she would face this new phase with dignity. Gordana adjusted herself on the bed, her gaze fixed on the family photo as she tried to find some comfort in the memories of a time that would never return. She knew the road ahead would be lonely, but she also knew that somehow, she would need to find the strength to carry on alone, but with the dignity that no one could take from her. Gordana's first days in the nursing home were marked by a mix of confusion and sadness. The realization that she had been deceived by Milan and Jelena loomed over her like a dark cloud, and the initial shock turned into quiet sadness. Gordana, however, was a resilient woman. Gradually, she began to explore the nursing home, trying to adapt to her new reality. The place was simple, with long and impersonal corridors, but clean and well-organized. It was not the home she had hoped for, but at least there, Gordana was treated with a dignity her children had failed to provide. In the dining hall during meals, Gordana observed the other residents. There were people of all ages, each with their own stories and sorrows. Some more animated, others, like her, still trying to find new meaning in their days. Slowly, Gordana got used to the routine of the nursing home, the punctual meals, the recreational activities some ventured to participate in, and the occasional visits from relatives of other residents. Gordana, however, did not expect any visits. She knew that Milan and Jelena were unlikely to return to see her, and this certainty was both a relief and a deep pain. It was during one of these quiet lunches that Gordana met Zorana, a caregiver at the nursing home, a woman in her 40s with a warm smile and a calm demeanor that immediately won Gordana over. Zorana noticed Gordana's quietness from the first day and intuitively began to approach her. She always made sure Gordana was comfortable, helped with meals, and offered to take short walks through the nursing home's garden. Over time, Gordana began to open up to Zorana, and the caregiver became her emotional support. Zorana understood the depth of Gordana's sadness and the complexity of her story. She learned how Gordana had been a successful businesswoman, how she had fought alongside Dragan to build an empire, and how, ironically, the family Gordana had cherished so much had become estranged because of the money and properties that now meant nothing to her. "You're stronger than you think, Mrs. Gordana," Zorana would say, holding Gordana's frail hands with a firm and supportive grip. "These letters, they are your legacy. They show how much love and wisdom you still have to share." Gordana would thank Zorana's support with a gentle smile, but inside she felt the exhaustion intensify. The pain in her joints, the difficulty breathing, and the constant sense of fatigue began to take over her body. But Gordana didn't want to show how bad she was feeling. She didn't want Zorana or anyone else to see how much the illness was draining her strength. Still, Gordana continued to write, even on the days when she could barely hold the pen. She believed her words would be a testimony, a way to record everything she had lived and learned. The letters became her last refuge, a space where she could be true to herself, away from the judgments and falsehoods that had marked her life in recent years. As the days passed, Gordana's frailty became more evident. Visits to the doctor became more frequent, and she grew even more dependent on Zorana's care. However, Gordana never lost her dignity. She kept her head held high, even when her strength threatened to fail, and continued to find small moments of joy in her daily interactions with Zorana and the other residents. Gordana knew her time was running out, but there was serenity in her acceptance. For her, living with dignity and love, even in the most difficult moments, was the greatest victory she could achieve. And as long as she could write, as long as she could keep the flame of her memories alive, Gordana knew her story wasn't over yet. In her final letters, Gordana wrote about her hope that one day Milan and Jelena would read her words and understand the love she had always had for them, despite everything. She wished that somehow her words could touch her children's hardened hearts, bringing a reflection on what truly matters in life. And so, even debilitated and with her health fragile, Gordana continued to fight in the only way she had left, with words and with love. Milan and Jelena's only visit to the nursing home happened on a cloudy day when Gordana was visibly weaker. They arrived together, bringing a bouquet of withered flowers and forced smiles. Gordana greeted them with a serene look, disguising the surprise and pain of seeing them after so long. She didn't expect demonstrations of affection, but their distance still hurt, even silently. Milan and Jelena kept a polite tone, exchanging a few words with their mother while looking around the nursing home, as if they were just fulfilling a formality. Gordana, sitting in her favorite armchair near the window, watched them with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. She knew this visit was a hollow gesture, an inconvenient commitment they both wanted to end as soon as possible. In a moment of carelessness, believing Gordana couldn't hear, Milan and Jelena began to talk among themselves. They spoke about how life had become easier since Gordana was at the nursing home, away from their busy routines and family responsibilities. Jelena mentioned the relief of no longer having to worry about her mother's daily care, while Milan agreed, adding that it was best for everyone. Gordana, her gaze fixed on the window, let out a soft sigh. She watched her children's reflections in the glass, capturing the expressions of relief and coldness they bore. There was no surprise in their words, just a painful confirmation of what Gordana already knew. Even without hearing, she felt each word like an invisible knife cutting away any remaining illusion about her children's love. With the visit coming to an end, Milan and Jelena hurriedly said their goodbyes. Gordana, with her usual dignity, waved and smiled, once again hiding the knowledge she carried about their true intentions. She watched them leave, leaving behind a trail of indifference that was heavier than any silence. Alone once more, Gordana returned to her armchair and picked up one of the letters she was writing to herself. She scribbled a few words with her trembling hand, expressing what her heart held, a mix of pain, acceptance, and the final understanding that despite everything, her dignity would remain intact. Her children may have chosen the path of neglect, but Gordana would choose, until the end, the path of silent dignity. Gordana felt that the end was near. The days at the nursing home grew shorter, and her strength diminished with each dawn. With the certainty that she had little time left, Gordana dedicated her remaining energy to writing a series of letters. In these pages, she poured out the weight of her life, the joys with Dragan, the silent pain of being ignored by her children, and the truth she had kept so well. She had never lost her hearing. In the letters, Gordana revealed how she had chosen to remain silent, watching her children with an attentive gaze, hoping to see in them the love she had once known. She confessed her deep disappointment, but also her unconditional love. The words were sincere and painful, but carried a final hope that Milan and Jelena might one day understand the true importance of what they had lost and rediscover the value of love and family. With the letters ready, Gordana called Zorana, her caregiver and friend, entrusting her with one last task. "Please, deliver these letters to my lawyer, Bogdan Petrović, when I am no longer here," Gordana requested with a calm and resolute look. Zorana nodded, holding Gordana's hands, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that these letters were not just an outpouring, but the final legacy of a woman who, even in the face of abandonment, chose forgiveness and dignity. Gordana's passing was as quiet as the last year she had spent in the nursing home. Her already weakened health could not withstand the weight of the days, and she passed away on a cold morning when the sun still hesitated to break through the clouds. Gordana's funeral was simple, a modest event that reflected her silent dignity. There were no exuberant flowers or grand speeches, just the respect of the nursing home staff and a few residents who bid farewell with sadness. The absence of her children was a painful symbol of how Gordana's life had drifted from the family she had once loved so much. Milan and Jelena did not attend the funeral, too busy with their own lives to care about their mother's final rites. To them, Gordana was already a turned page, and their attention was focused on what truly mattered, the inheritance they believed would be the next chapter. The day after the burial, Milan and Jelena were summoned by lawyer Bogdan Petrović for the reading of Gordana's will. Bogdan's office was an austere place with dark wooden walls and shelves filled with legal books that gave the environment an air of seriousness. Milan arrived first, checking the time on his wristwatch and adjusting his tie. Jelena entered shortly after with a cold demeanor and an impatient look, as if she were at a business meeting. They sat side by side, exchanging brief and formal greetings like two strangers sharing a common goal. Bogdan Petrović, a man with graying hair and a firm gaze, entered the room with a serious expression, holding a leather folder that contained Gordana's will. He greeted the siblings with a nod and sat in front of them, slowly opening the folder. Milan and Jelena tried to maintain their composure, but the gleam in their eyes revealed their expectation for the reading of the will. The family mansion, the company's shares, the money, everything they believed was rightfully theirs was about to be confirmed, or so they thought. "Thank you for coming," Bogdan began in a deep voice. "Before I start the formal reading of the will, there is a letter from your mother that must be read." She requested that her words be heard before anything else. Milan and Jelena exchanged slightly uncomfortable glances. A letter? They hadn't expected that. Bogdan took out a folded sheet from the folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. "My dear children," the letter began. Gordana's handwriting was firm, but there was a softness in the words, as if she was speaking to them directly from across the room. "If you are hearing this, I am no longer physically present, but my words are my last gift to you. I want you to know that in all moments, my love never ceased to exist. Even in the most difficult times, when I felt invisible and unwanted, my love for you remained." Milan crossed his arms impatiently. Jelena looked at the floor, avoiding eye contact with her brother and the lawyer. Bogdan's voice continued as he read the words Gordana had left with such sincerity. "You believed that I was oblivious to what was happening around me, that my deafness was a veil that prevented me from understanding what was going on. But the truth is, I was never deaf. I heard every word, every plan, every wish that pushed me away from your lives. I heard you talk about how much easier it would be if I wasn't here, and I heard when you decided to send me to a nursing home as one discards something that is no longer useful." Milan and Jelena remained static. The room seemed to grow colder, and the weight of Gordana's words fell upon them like a cutting blade. Bogdan paused, observing the two over his glasses, before continuing the reading. "Dragan and I built a life of sacrifices, hard work, and shared dreams. When he left, part of me went with him, but I fought to keep what we had built. You believed that the company was bankrupt, that I was vulnerable and in need of help, but the truth is, I kept the financial reality hidden from you, hoping that somehow love would be more important than money." Milan widened his eyes, and Jelena felt a chill run down her spine. Bogdan continued without diverting his gaze from the letter. "The company was never bankrupt. The situation was a choice of mine, a way to see where your hearts truly lay. You chose the easy path, the one of greed, and forgot what it means to be a family. The mansion, the company, and what many consider material wealth have no value without the true treasure of life, the love and respect for those who love us." Milan lowered his head, feeling his face heat with shame and disbelief. Jelena blinked several times, trying to absorb the impact of the revelations. Gordana's letter was not just a farewell, it was a painful confession from a mother who had understood the true nature of her children. Bogdan continued reading the last words of the letter. "I have decided that my legacy will not be measured solely by possessions, but by the care I received when I needed it most. The mansion and most of my inheritance will be donated to the nursing home that took care of me in my final days. There, I found the respect and dignity that were lacking in the moments when I needed you." After finishing the letter, Bogdan carefully folded it and proceeded with the official reading of the will. Milan and Jelena listened in silence, each word weighing on them like a final judgment. As for the division of assets, Bogdan began, "It is established that 5% of the inheritance will go to Milan and 5% to Jelena. Another 10% will be reserved for Safija, your granddaughter, who showed affection and care in difficult times. Gordana wrote a special letter for Safija to read when she turns 18, explaining her grandmother's true story, the values she always defended, and the importance of love over greed." On hearing the mention of the letter to Safija, Milan and Jelena fell into an even deeper silence, aware that their granddaughter would receive not only a part of the inheritance, but also Gordana's true moral legacy. Gordana wanted Safija to know the true story so that she could learn from the family's mistakes and cultivate the values her grandmother cherished: respect, empathy, and unconditional love. The rest of the inheritance, including the mansion, the company, and movable assets, will be donated to the nursing home that cared for Gordana in her last days. The siblings were devastated. The promise of wealth and comfort that had brought them there was dissipating in light of Gordana's decisions. They hadn't just lost a fortune, they had lost their mother irrevocably, with no chance for forgiveness or reconciliation. Milan and Jelena left the office in silence, with the harsh reality that their greed had cost them not only the inheritance, but the opportunity to honor and value the one who had loved them the most. As they walked away, Gordana's lesson lingered in the air. The choices we make, guided by love or greed, define the true legacy we leave in the world. For Milan and Jelena, only regret remained, and the harsh certainty that sometimes the riches that matter most are those that cannot be bought. Safija, in turn, would carry with her not just a material part of Gordana's legacy, but a life lesson that could transform the future.